Pramodji, whenever you want us, we can start when you give us signal.
I feel like this is the Olympics and we're ready for the gun.
Yes, exactly.
No false starts, please. No false starts.
Yeah, no false start. I do appreciate your sense of humor. This is a kind of Olympics for us because you are there with us.
As long as I don't have to try to pass the baton through the screen, it would be a big challenge.
May I request
Yes.
Dr. Sundeva sir,
Okay, should we
Vice
start?
President of iSPELL, to start the event formally.
Okay, thank you so much. Now we formally begin. Today we are really blessed and highly privileged and greatly honored that we have a professor of big repute, a big name with us at the international level, Dr. Gerald Kupchik from University of Toronto. We are going to listen to him. Dr. Gerald Kupchik has been kind enough that he has acceded to our request, and he was very glad and very happy to deliver a talk today on this platform. As far as I remember, our association with Dr. Gerald is very old. I remember the event, he organized one event, IGEL 2000, at the University of Toronto. And we were corresponding with him for months altogether. We were a delegation of 3 people. And at that time, procuring a visa, Canadian visa, was a Herculean task. And we were corresponding with him. And he was so kind enough to supply us with a pile of letters, good recommendations and good letters, so that we were able to get visa, Canadian visa. And he was aware of all our struggles. And when we just embarked on our journey and we just went to the university campus, Toronto, just opposite museum on Yonge and Bloor Street, he could identify us. He could see us that these three musketeers are from India. Came to us, rushing to us. He said, we all suffer, and we suffer, and we could know. And later on, we came to know that he is not only a wonderful professor, a professor of great eminence who organized such a wonderful global event, IGL 2000, at the University of Toronto under ISA, Indian Sociological Association. But we found him a great human being, a wonderful human being, amazing person. And I still enjoy, relish, and appreciate his sense of humor. He's always full of humor and full of witty remarks and full of wisdom. And his talks are full of epigrams, epigrammatic terseness, and pithy pointed sayings, which appeal to our intellect and which go down to our hearts at times. So such is the greatness of Professor Gerald. And during the last 1 year, during the pandemic, I requested him a couple of times to be a speaker, and he was kind enough to accept our request at various platforms. And we were the 3 professors, Dr. Shashikant Bhatt, Professor Yashpal Vyas, and I myself. He invited all 3 of us to Toronto, and he was also kind enough to visit Indore in an international conference. So I heartily welcome him. I welcome it with from the core of our heart, from iSPELL. Sir, iSPELL is such an association which the motto is to facilitate to elevate. And this is the 48th lecture. And this started with the Teachers' Day last year from 5th of September during the times of pandemic. And our organizing secretary, G.A. Ghansham, from pandemic, he converted it to academic. And since then, under his leadership, under his guidance, these events have been going on unhampered. And very soon on 5th September, we are going to complete our 1-year lecture series. So we have a lot of corpus available on YouTube and Facebook in terms of, so our president is Jyoti Patil Madam, under whose guidance this association is flourishing. And the month of August has been given to me as event coordinator. So my job is to speak only for 5 minutes in the beginning, and I'll hand over the entire responsibility of the entire session to Swati Reddy. So I must introduce Swati Reddy to this platform today. Swati Reddy is an assistant professor at Reva University, Bangalore, and the Department of English. She has to her credit 7 years of experience, and she has worked in various other colleges as well. She's very dynamic, full of enthusiasm, and she has also conducted FDP along with Dr. Payal at Reva University, Bangalore. She has also, to her credit, a lot of published work and research articles in ISBN and ISSN books. And she's also pursuing her doctorate at the same university, Reva. And so I hand over the responsibility to Ms. Swati Reddy to take over the charge and initiate the proceedings. So she will conduct and compare, and she's the master of ceremony today. And our chairperson is Dr. Kshamata Chaudhary. And I welcome the president, Jyoti Patil Madam. I welcome Dr. Gerald Kupchik as a keynote speaker, organizing secretary, Dr. J. Ghansham, and all the learned and august audience, and all the worthy members of the executive committee. So over to you, Dr. Swati.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashok Sachdeva, sir. A very good evening to one and all who have joined us virtually. The Indian Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature heartily welcomes you all to this cerebral conglomeration. I, Professor Swati Reddy, research scholar and assistant professor from the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, Reva University, deem it an honor to be a part of today's session. It is indeed a proud privilege to be a part of this 48th Sahitya Satsang. And now may I take the opportunity, and I really consider it an honor, to introduce the resource person of today's session, Dr. Gerald C. Kupchik, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And Dr. Gerald builds a bridge between science and the humanities, arguing that interactions between mind and body in everyday life are analogous to relations between subject matter and style in art. His research focuses on imagination, emotion, aesthetic and design processes, using quantitative and qualitative methods to elucidate underlying processes across Eastern and Western cultures. Dr. Gerald currently is exploring the roots of creative imagination in science and the arts by working closely with practitioners and those who interpret or utilize their works. His goal is to develop unified models which account for imagination and emotion. He is well known for the book, The Aesthetics of Emotion, and his lectures are always combined with lively examples and inspiring thoughts that can be applied to in real life. I heartily welcome you, sir, to today's session. And I think now, without much further ado, I request the resource person, Dr. Gerald C. Kupchik, to share his insights on the topic, spiritual engagement with literature, reducing isolation during a pandemic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'd first like to thank my dear friend Ashok, who keeps bringing me to India in different contexts to share ideas and thoughts and to be nurtured by India. I'd like to thank Professor Reddy and also Dr. Chaudhary for their kindness in supervising this event. Perhaps I'd like to turn now to India having celebrated the 75th Independence Day yesterday. Usual pride, as it says in Wikipedia, even there, to mark its freedom from British rule. And the theme of my lecture is the distinction between freedom from colonial supervision, to freedom from the pandemic, freedom to explore the self. There are certain thematic words that I saw that Ashok sent along to me. The idea to facilitate, to elevate, and I'm going to add to facilitate, to elevate, and to illuminate. As you can see, the title of my lecture is Spiritual Engagement with Literature, Reducing Isolation During a Pandemic. As I've said in my earlier lectures in India, I'd like to draw your attention to the findings of our study of students at the University of Toronto, 850 to be sure, students, many of South Asian origins. And we found a situation of at-risk students. They describe themselves as being in poor current health, high personal health risk, having difficulty focusing on everyday activities and or work due to anxiety and financial concerns. They were less likely to practice precautionary measures to avoid contracting COVID-19 and are aware that they don't. They lack self-confidence. They get their information about COVID from social media platforms, not official channels. They don't blame the government or the university, but they're in a very negative emotional state. They lack physical support in the home, and they see their futures in a negative light. They appear to be burned out. Having to cope with high demands at home in the absence of support, in essence, their ego strength is depleted. How do I build a bridge between this situation that we face in Canada, that we face at our university, that you face in India, and that we all confront around the world? What role do the humanities in general and poetry in particular play to help break through the sense of isolation that students feel? As a professor for almost 50 years now, I confront in a novel way the challenges that my students face at the University of Toronto, as do you. What is our role to help them? I'm going to provide some context for my lecture. And this is a slide, actually, I'm just going to read it, that I show at the beginning of my history course for almost 50 years. And it comes from Pascal, the French philosopher's Pensée. Man is only a reed, the feeblest reed in nature, but he is a thinking reed. There is no need for the entire universe to arm itself in order to annihilate him. A vapor, a drop of water suffices to kill him. But were the universe to crush him, man would yet be more noble than that which slays him, because he knows that he dies and the advantage that the universe has over him. Of this, the universe knows nothing. Is this not an appropriate phrasing even now, in 2021, as we confront a disease that can annihilate us? And then he goes on to say, when I considered the brief span of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and behind it, the small space that I fill or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces which I know not and which know not me, I am afraid, and wonder to see myself here rather than there. For there is no reason why I should be here rather than there, now rather than then. What's the point? The concept of thrownness. We are thrown into this pandemic, as are the students. And while we may teach from home, we can remember in our nostalgic minds our own lives as undergraduates and graduate students, of interactions with others and the freedom of expression that our students have missed this year. One of my students in India is listening along now, who will not be able to join others at the University of Toronto this fall. This is our challenge to help them. And I will discuss the aesthetics of that process. When we look at different professors and different scholars and we look at ourselves, it is not sufficient just to say that I study poetry or literature or Shakespeare, but who am I in the sense of thrownness? Who am I, Gerald Kupchak, as a scholar? And I turn to, I turn to my own origins, to Friedrich Schiller, the German Romantic philosopher. In the 15th letter of his Education of Man, he states, "Let there be a play drive, since only the union of reality and form, contingency and necessity, passivity with freedom makes the concept of human nature complete." For him, the play drive is a conjoining through contradiction of the human experience of the finite and the infinite, of freedom and time, of sense and reason, of life and form. The object of the play drive is the living form. And so this is a leitmotif of today's lecture, because part of my point is that active engagement with literature provides a framework and a vehicle for us to know ourselves, for us to help the students at risk escape the isolation that they feel, to break out of the cocoon of fear, that aesthetics and aesthetic engagement and personal expression can be a vehicle for doing this. And so in the background of my mind, I have consideration for transcendental poetry. And Friedrich Schlegel, another of the German romantics, writing in 1800, there is a poetry whose one and all is a relationship of the ideal and the real. It should just thus be called transcendental poetry. But we should not care for a transcendental philosophy unless it is portrayed the producer along with the product, unless it embraced in its system of transcendental thoughts a characterization of transcendental thinking. Poetry is not infrequently encountered in modern poets. We should combine transcendental materials and exercises of engagement. So this becomes a mechanism behind my teaching, behind my own research of late. That it is not the poem or work of literature on its own, but the poem or work of literature must always be seen in relation to the context within which it is created, to the context of creation of the individual whose expression realized it, and the context of appreciation. So in the back of my mind, I think of these students isolated in the cocoon in the pandemic, being encouraged to write their thoughts, to diary themselves, to find a piece of literature that speaks to them. So the important point that we take away here, first, from Pascal, we get thrownness. We are thrown into a world. We are thrown into this pandemic. From the German romantics, we get a sense of activity and action. We are not the passive recipients of literature. We are the active creators of the literature. We are active creators of the interpretation. And we remind us in the back of our memories of the liberation of India from British rule, freedom from and freedom to. So I cannot encourage enough in my students and advise us together collectively as professors and teachers to provide the vehicle for students to find themselves. I turn to the psychologist William James, one of the founders of American psychology, lived toward the end of the 19th century. In the varieties of religious experience, he considers the central function of human consciousness to make sense of reality through abstract concepts. He says, the whole universe of concrete objects as we know them swims in a wider and higher universe of abstract ideas that lend its significance. As time, space, and the ether soak through all things, so we feel to abstract and essential goodness, beauty, strength, significance, justice, soak through all things good, strong, significant, and just. So we hear this continuity into a psychology, not just of active participation, but as we go beyond the self into the literary, there's an action of engagement that takes us into nature, beyond ourselves, into a domain of hope. Look what he says. Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type, whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch, they are there in all their completeness, definite types of mentality that somewhere have their field of application. Is this not what poetry is? Is this not what literature is? A domain of engagement to take us out of the cocoon into the thrownness of our life, to engage in active play for the purpose of finding ourselves. And so I take these scholars as the framework of my understanding. And I think it is true for us all that we are not merely teachers. We are not merely researchers. We come from a certain tradition. You in India have a rich tradition reaching back thousands of years. And in recognizing our transition and our tradition and our origins, and in swimming in the diversity of knowledge and frameworks that resonate with us, we provide a framework and opportunity for surviving a pandemic. So now I'll become much more practical. I will turn to the domain that you would normally expect a scholar to speak about. In this case, poetry. And I state, poetry is a state of mind supported by sound and word of felt meaning in a transitory moment of expression that can heal the soul. Poetry is a state of mind supported by sound and word of felt meaning in a transitory moment of expression that can heal the soul. This thought came to me yesterday at my cottage as I emerged from my kayak, my zone of sanity, where floating on the water, we rhythmically find ourselves. And I asked the question, what is a poem? And remember perhaps in my earlier lecture that there are two teams in Western literary thinking. One team does a formal analysis of the structure of the work. The organization to which Ashok made reference, EAGLE, of which I was president from 1998 to 2000, was founded by a group of professors from Germany and the Netherlands who recalled with distaste their teachers in high school who told them that there was only one way to understand literature. It came in an era of reader response where we affirmed the active engagement, à la Schiller, of the creator and the reader. So in essence, the poem is an emergent phenomenon. It always exists illusory in isolation, on the page for analysis, for correct analysis. I step back from that and emphasize the interpretive moment. I'm going back to the first seconds of my lecture, freedom from and freedom to the vehicle of play, of understanding the poem and finding ourselves. So it is a layered structure, the poem. There is sound that has a certain syntax that may be quick or may be slow, that has meaning and reference to events, and the relationship between that about which one writes and the sound within which it floats becomes a framework for an embodied metaphor, the experience of emerging meaning. And all this can be in a visual layout. In Germany, the concrete poets could take a poem and break the letters apart as if they fall on the page. So a poem is a structure, sound with meaning sitting on top of it in a context of creation and interpretation. That is the poem. But I'm a psychology professor. I'm concerned with acts of creation, acts of imagination, and acts of creation that can follow the formal rules that we are taught in school, but moments of expression and freedom, where our individual sense freedom too breaks through within the framework of personal growth. We did a study last year on story making and found that those in a more positive mood and a concern for growth, the stories that they wrote were based on symbolism and metaphor, not merely concrete words of fact. So the act of creation exists within an instrumental formal framework, and it offers the opportunity for personal expression that reflects our growth. And is this not, in essence, what the German Romantics were about? Because they understood the conflicts that lie within us, They understood in the early 1800s with the modernization of society, the challenges that people faced. And so they understood that the creative act is a process of growth, is a process of self-exploration that occurs within the framework of aesthetic traditions. So we know where we come from, and yet within that frame, we act to find ourselves. Within that frame, we can break the cocoon of isolation, of the pandemic, and the lack of support to explore ourselves, freedom too. And so when we think of acts of reception, acts of engagement with poetry placed on the table in front of us by our teachers and on the screen and by our parents, we can speak of the three modes of reception: the mere reading, the hearing the poem read aloud, and the seeing the poem performed. My student, Michelle Hilcher, did precisely this research years ago. And what did she do? She had written some poetry. And either the students read the poem alone in the laboratory, or they listened to her recorded reading of the poem, or they watched her perform it before them. I thought to watch the person perform it, to watch the creator actually express before you would be the winning condition. I was wrong. The winning condition was the silent reading in private, because there are fewer constraints and the opportunity for imaginative expression is even greater. So when we think of breaking the cocoon of the pandemic, the cocoon of isolation, we cannot emphasize enough the engagement of the self in acts of interpretation, the search for meaning in the midst of the contradictions of life. The Romantics are writing in the early 1800s, and 200 years later, they captured the soul of the student and those in India and Canada who've lost loved ones, who struggle for meaning in the midst of a pandemic that seemingly came from nowhere. And then I asked myself the question, what aspect of poetry fosters the heightened consciousness to which William James made reference, the self-transcendence that helps take us from the isolation of the cocoon into nature and to spiritual awareness? This is a topic that I searched and studied today. It is the escape from the cocoon into nature. And while your association revels in the English language, to me, I am privileged to study with colleagues around the world in their language, which they can translate into English for me. And so it may be the English word, but it is the theme of both painting in the Chinese style. The painter and philosopher Zhang Bing, living 375 AD to 425 AD, I traveled around China, visiting spiritual places, thinking and writing, while the people in Europe were stuck in their forests looking for mushrooms. The Chinese were philosophizing, as were the Indians. And when he was older and unable to travel, he would paint from memory the places he had been and travel to them in his imagination as a vehicle for liberation. Is there not liberation from the cocoon of the pandemic? Can we not encourage people to fly from themselves into the possibilities of the future rather than being trapped and feeling imprisoned by the threats of the pandemic and the lack of supports around them? So this is my theme. Look how I am nurtured. I am nurtured as an experimental psychologist in different domains by Chinese philosophers from so early, almost 2 millennia ago, who wake us to travel, spiritual liberation. And I encourage all of us within the framework of our own cultures to explore the structures of literature that provide the vehicles of liberation. And then I ask myself a question. And I put the question on the table for you as well as scholars and researchers and teachers. What aspect of poetry fosters this liberation? In the museum in Shanghai, they have beautiful traditional landscape paintings, and at the left of the painting, there was an empty space for a poet to come and with his brush of calligraphy place a poem that stood in relation to the image. This is during the Six Dynasties, a period of upheaval. And those of us who pride ourselves in our articles, imagine what it took to permit someone to come in and to express themselves in print, in calligraphy, adjacent to your image. Is this not what collaboration is about? Is this not what shared liberation is about? And so I put on the table an hypothesis, and I recommend to you the work, I'm simply a visitor here, but of Reuben Sur, the Israeli scholar who won the Israel Prize toward a theory of cognitive poetics, a founder of the discipline of cognitive poetics. What aspect of the structure of the poem is liberating? And I stand not even in his shadow, a lovely gentleman, to explore these questions and invite you to ask yourself the question: when these words are placed next to each other in the poem, what is the mechanism of liberation? What is the mechanism of transcendence? Is it the harmony, or is it the discordance between the words and the sounds? Because discordance seems to go hand in hand with imagination. Recall that the German Romantics accepted the reality of confusion within us in search of identity. And now we transpose that to the surface of the poem, where the juxtaposition of images does not readily resolve, but opens the door for our imagination to imagine itself, to build a bridge. In psychology, we speak of remote associations. So imagine the image of the painting that is suffused with light, not even a shadow of the small person who appears, that invites us into nature, as poetry invites us into sound. What is the mechanism of liberation? Is it the juxtaposition of words that are not normally found in everyday life, as per William James, that bring us to a higher moral level, that bring us to the domain of beauty? Or is it discordance between the sounds and the words that establish a framework of liberation for us to explore, to release to the sublime a state of mind? And so that is how I'm looking at poetry. It is not a poem on the page. It is not Shakespeare on the page. This is an illusion of transitory permanence, because as the painting on the wall deteriorates over time, so does the page melt into the screen that we view. And it is virtual as we are today. And our relationship to the virtual word may be the mechanism of release. So poetry is a state of mind, nurtured by word before us, that is an expression of a period of time and a manifestation from the soul of the creator, himself, herself, themself, filled with conflict, manifesting those juxtapositions to us when within Friedrich Schiller's notion of play, that we build bridges, we combine and recombine, and the more ambiguous the relations among the words, the greater the room for creative interpretation. And so I return to my theme. My theme is a theme of liberation in honor of India's Day of Liberation yesterday, a movement freedom from domination, freedom to be ourselves, in India's case as a nation state, in my case, for my students, to be ourselves, emerging from the cocoon of isolation into the domain of freedom, into personal meaning. And so as a psychologist, I move from the poem to the active listener, the active reader, the active performer. My friend Yuval Avital, Israeli, living in Milan, has created a platform that I invite you to visit, Human Signs. We're in the pandemic, in isolation, in a hotel in the middle of northern Italy. He invites his wife and daughter to go to the garden, and he sits before a screen and expresses his feeling of the cocoon of isolation. And he sends it to friends and scholars, dancers and singers around the world who engage in a response to it, a kind of resonance to it, a sing along, dance along to it. And if you look up Human Signs, Yuval Avital, Avital, you will see the beautiful montage of engagement and liberation, freedom too. And so as a psychologist, I move from the poem and the story on the page to the individual in a process of liberation, feeling the embodied meaning, the sounds. And I will read a few items to close my lecture. Aware of the self-reference and resonance. If we look back in Greek history and we study the sublime, and we study the theme of resonance, as my dear friend Despinas Stamatopoulos has done in Crete, we see that early on in the tradition of Dionysus, there was rhythmical engagement and movement. And we can imagine that in the prehistory of humankind, sitting together around the fire with sound and sway, the origins of poetry itself. And from the sound and sway into words as culture evolved, we see a resonance to the self. This poem speaks to me. This poem is of my life. This poem is of the concrete details of my being, of my thrownness. But I add something here. I add that in the midst of the pandemic, is it not a responsibility of professors and teachers and students to help ourselves and others break through the boundaries of the cocoon and use literature and interpretation of literature and encouragement of diary and encouragement of poetic writing as a vehicle of engaging with the self? And here's my point: passing beyond the self into nature and otherness, moving from isolation, the cocoon of the pandemic, to a shared experience of reality that we in Canada share with you in India. The return of the self to others. And so as the Buddha attaining Satori, when I move beyond myself into nature, when I am Zongbing alone, flying to the mountains of the imagined pastoral settings I visited in my youth, do I have a responsibility to return? As a professor for 50 years, almost, is it not my responsibility to return and engage in acts of grace, to encourage others, to explore themselves, to get beyond the fears, to find renewed hopes in their relations with others and encounters with nature as a vehicle for doing so? Each time I paddle my kayak, I'm awakened to the symmetry of the waves. So what do we say in the end? We say in the end that poetry can facilitate, it can resonate, because it is meaningful to me, and the sound is meaningful to me in the being of my thrownness. And as Ashok would say, it can elevate us. And I add, it can illuminate us, and it can educate us. And so we all, in a respect for the English language, have encountered William Blake to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. A robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. A dove house filled with doves and pigeons, and it goes on. In our childhoods, in our high schools, in our classes, we have encountered Coleridge's Kubla Khan, and remember Coleridge's willing suspension of disbelief. I permit myself to emerge from the cocoon into the aesthetics of being. In Xanadu to Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure-domed decree where Alph, the sacred river, ran to caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and so on. But we see, as I go back to my theme, the juxtaposition of words that take us beyond the pragmatics of daily discourse. Floating on the rhythm and meter of sound, we are liberated from the pragmatics of daily life into being and meaning. This liberation, freedom from colonial rule, freedom to ourselves. And Goethe, again of the German Romantics, a founder of modern botany, and the great German poet and playwright. To the full moon rising, are you leaving me already? Only now you were so near, cloud mass shadows I see, and you're no longer there, and you feel how sad I am. Your rim still shines a star, telling me how loved I am, though my beloved far. So pursue now brighter, brighter, purer ways with greater light, through my heart and pain beats faster, more than blessed in the night. And I turn from the West in a pan-aesthetic attitude to the East with my dear colleague, Professor Xia Wang, who has written on the sublime. As we walk through the campus of the university in the midst of the pandemic, talking of the sublime. And she cites early Chinese poets. No traces of ancients I see ahead of me. No intimation of future I discern in back of me. Musing on the long, long eternity of heaven and earth, my tears fall upon the solitary outpouring of my deep grief. And we move from Goethe to the Chinese poet, Zhenzing. And we see this transition is the same. So while we move from one domain to the other, it is the same. And I cannot recommend enough the work of David Hinton, the American poet who translates Chinese. And again, we see the moon, moonrise, thin slice of ascending light, arc-tipped. Aside all its bell-eyed dark, the new moon appears and scarcely risen beyond ancient frontier passes, edges beyond clouds, silver. Changeless, the Star River spreads across empty mountains, scoured with cold white. Dew dust the courtyard chrysanthemum, blossoms clotted there with swollen dark. And we are reminded of the blessed nature of the translator, because look how beautifully he takes the Chinese poem and renders it in English. So what is Professor Kupchak, a visitor from Toronto in the midst of the pandemic, coming with hope, facing the realities of his students, burdened at home? As you know, the South Asian students, the eldest child in the family, must take over responsibility, and they are yet at school, and they are yet worried about their futures. And so we together come as poets, we together come as teachers, we together bring hope. And what is the hope? The hope is the clarity of consciousness. The hope is the movement, freedom to. The hope is the movement to the sound and the layering of our being into the particulars of our life, and through the vehicle of the poem into the transcendent state of liberation that gives us hope. What is my point in the end? You, as I, are thrown into a life, as are our students. You and I have a responsibility collectively together to them and to our fellow citizens. You and I have a responsibility to help people accept the sounds, not just the poetry, but the sounds of their being, not just their histories, but the histories of all of us together to break out of the cocoon. The story of the poem, of juxtaposition of words in the midst of sound that float along the top of the sounds as metaphors of being, in and of itself is a metaphor for our life. In and of itself has the sadness and the hope. In and of itself has the speed and the slowness. In and of itself can bring us back to life, to appreciate time, to look forward with hope, to float upon the being of the moment, reaching for the stars. Thank you for your patient listening. Thank you very much. Thus ends my story.
Thank you so much, sir. It was indeed an enlightening session. And the kind of statements that you made, that we are not passive receivers, but active creators of literature, and that poetry is a state of mind. Frankly speaking, it actually took me to those artists, literary stalwarts, be it British or American or even Indian for that matter, who had a lot to say on poetry, psychology, culture, and the kind of correlation that you pointed out between literature and psychology. I think that was just amazing, sir. Thank you so much. Now we have the question and answer session. We will just take up the question, sir.
It is always easiest to give the speech and to watch it emerge from our mouth as if by accident. And then come the questions raised a fear in the heart of the professor. I will do my best.
Well said, sir.
Or Ashok can even, or you can read them, or someone might send one as I see 13 chat elements. Someone might send a question by chat that you can share with me if you like.
Yes, Dr. Jiral, this has been indeed a very intellectual session, with intellectual deliberation. It has widened our horizons, some kind of insight that we could have today. It's always lovely, it's always wonderful to listen to your lectures. I take them as sermons, and we have benefited a lot. You have a different perspective altogether that you have to offer to your listeners. It's a different perspective, different angle of thought, a different approach as human beings, which we need to cultivate, which is the need of the time, the crying need during this pandemic times also. What we need is all these virtues and qualities that we need to harbor, have to carry within ourselves. I would invite in this Q&A session, question and answer session, if you have questions, it's a rare opportunity. You can ask and clarify your doubts. We have Dr. Gerald with us today, this evening. So actually usually we have literary Sunday satsang on every Sunday at 4 p.m. But because of independence yesterday, which was the 75th year starting, we had to keep it today on Monday, 6:30 p.m. Indian time. So I invite the participants, the attendees, and all the dignitaries here in this platform to ask questions if you have any.
Or send me an email. Send me an email. You can post my email.
Yes, sir. And sir is kind enough to invite emails from you, and he'll be able to answer your queries. At
Live
times,
in fear. I respond so quickly that you will live
yes,
in fear.
yes. Yashpal, would you like to ask a question?
Sure, sure.
Yashpal, sir, sir is
Yes, yes.
remembering you.
It's the good
Yes,
old days
yes.
with my boys.
Hello, sir.
Hi, Yashpal. Love and regards to your family.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm so nice of you. Sir, how are you, sir?
I'm here with my friends.
Sir,
Yashpal, sir,
I'm
And I
sorry
have
that.
to add that that's the beauty of Zoom. I didn't have to get on the plane and go to London and switch to Mumbai and sit in the beautiful airport from midnight till 6:30 in the morning, waiting for the plane to indoor. And when I arrived, Yashpal and Ashok and Professor Bhatt were there with flowers.
Sir,
Is there
thank you
something
very
more
much, sir. You
beautiful?
remember. Thank you very much, sir. You remember us so many times, and it is a good time to talk to you. I'm sorry that I joined you very late due to some interruption in internet, but it is very nice, and I think it is a pleasure to listen you all the time whenever you speak something. Sir, I had don't have any question, but I'm going to quote a very good thing which you mentioned. What is hope? The clarity of consciousness. It's a great comment from your side, and I think that this is a very good. I think you have defined the hope in a very good way, in a very good manner. That sometimes if someone you ask that what is the hope, so I got a good clarification about the hope, and definitely I have enriched my knowledge about in this consciousness. So once again, sir, it is a nice time with you, and I'm listening you very live. And this is not a time to ask some personal questions, but definitely I will
But to
ask.
remember our good meals, even in Bhopal. But I want to say something about the issue of hope.
Yes.
As a psychologist, I cannot
Yes.
underscore enough to be honest with ourselves about our pain. Not to hide from our pain or the pain of others, but
Yes.
when we come out of ourselves and we understand that we share together with others a common circumstance, and this is what the pandemic has done. We realize a shared circumstance here and around the world. We see the climate tragedies here and around the world.
Yes.
And the more we come out of ourselves into a collective conscious and honesty with ourselves about pain, the other side of pain is hope. Because if we all are in circumstances together, we might say, what can we do individually and collectively to help others and to help ourselves globally? Think globally, act locally was what we said in the 1960s. And now it's think locally and act globally. See the transition. One of the beauties of Zoom. I'm with my pals in India and I didn't have to pack a suitcase. That's not bad, though I do miss the meals. So the bottom line is clarity with ourselves, and our relation with literature provides an opportunity for engagement with how other people see and how other people feel. And this is part of this emergence from isolation. My goal is to help students emerge from isolation with hope.
That's true, sir. That's true, sir. Thank you very much, sir. And I would also thank the Ashok that he has given me a good opportunity to talk to you, sir.
It's a pleasure.
And I'm wearing the ring that my dear friends helped me get in Indora, and the watch that I showed got me. I don't forget my pals. I just want to add one thing. You know, I lecture in different places, and I lecture in China where the big boss has the medium boss and the baby boss take care of me, and the students love to be the baby bosses. But in India, everybody was my babysitter. I did not have enough babysitters. So I can never owe you enough to pay you back. And even the ring is the right one. I wear it every day.
Others are welcome to ask questions. If you have any, we have so many participants from here. Manisha, Ranjan, and we have Rashmi Pastaria.
Ask whatever you like.
Yeah.
And I will make up a story to justify my existence.
Good evening, Professor Prabchik, Dr. Manisha
Thank you.
Pandey.
Thank you.
Hello. Good evening, Professor Prabchik.
Ask me a question.
How are you, Professor Prabchik? Good evening.
Who can complain? I'm with my dear friends. And I survived my lecture. You never know how the lecture will go. The lecture is a found object. It happens to you. As we all know as teachers, it doesn't matter how prepared you are. It's always sinking or swimming. I floated on the surface with hope. Another aspect of hope. So I'm prepared to answer whatever you like. Or pretend an answer to whatever you like. You see, everybody in India is too polite. They don't want to burden Professor Kubchik's neurons so early in the day before I've had a second coffee.
We have Dr. Sudhir Hajela, last week's keynote speaker. We have Vaishali Meshram with us, and Rakesh Degraskar. Vivek sir, you're welcome if you have any queries.
Type them.
So,
Look how polite everybody is.
I think Mr. Abhijit has.
Abhijit, yes,
Okay.
he has raised the hand. And I'm Arvind Jain, Ranjan sir, known as Ranjan sir, and I am thankful to Dr. Gerald. It was a really wonderful session, and we are really blessed, I can say. So keep blessing. Means again, we would be inviting you in the satsang, and we will be bothering you. But this botheration really, it was really very impressive, informative, and as someone just had commented that it was a combination of spiritualism and something else. So really, we are really delighted, elated to find you here. Thanks a lot. और हमारे यहाँ तो कहते हैं, I will use some Hindi here, कि मेरा चरण स्पर्श आपको. I bow on your feet. Okay. So Abhijit ji would like to say something. Okay. Please.
I wait quietly with fear.
over
And don't be too kind. I may ask you to adopt me.
Mr. Ranjan prayed to touch your feet.
Well, you know, in my world, you
Yes.
guys are so super polite. In
Yeah.
my world, all there is humility. In my world, look how lucky I am. And look how I wanted to actually start my lecture like this. Look how lucky we all are that we survived to become professors. Think of the friends you went to undergraduate school with. Think of the brilliant people that you knew who never made it into academia for one reason or another, because of fate, because of whatever reason. So the way I see it is I decided to do this when I was 12 years old, to be a professor of social psychology for whatever reason. And so look how lucky I am that I survived even the professors. And because we survived, all that's left for us is to remove the ego, to remove the delusions of self-importance. And all that is left is service to others. That's how I see it. If it would have been the 19th century, I would have been a rabbi. I'm a rabbi in the 21st century. That's how I see it. I carry the culture of the poor people of Eastern Europe. I carry the culture. Here's a beautiful quote from a rabbi in Israel who said, "It is written in the Bible, if you stop learning, the world will collapse." Is that not the responsibility of all of us? So it's not about the self. I'm so happy to have survived. And for me to tell stories to you guys and to laugh with Yashpal and Ashok and to show respect for Professor Bhatt, this is all that matters for me. The truth. Grace, gestures of grace from us to them. But no one's asking me a hard question. I'm waiting for a question. You guys are all too polite. The Independence Day had a very bad effect.
Over to the ceremony.
Sir, I have a question, sir.
Do it.
Sir, how does poetry offer courage in times of crisis or in facing the dire circumstances of life?
You know, what we do, one of the things we do in our research, one of the strategies of my research is that I have people choose episodes from their lives that they share with us. And I've seen shocking range of such episodes. A student writing a paper on happiness about a guy who was drug addicted and his mother came to his voice to commit suicide. And I'm looking, where's the happiness? The happiness is that he ended up working in a soup kitchen. He ended up the director of the soup kitchen. So when we ask the question, a poem that provides courage, I invite you as teachers, us as teachers, to have students select a poem or piece of literature itself, themselves, that gives them a sense of courage and then explain it. As if homework of life. Is it not homework of life when we listen to the tragic tales of others? I met a woman many years ago at an art class. The family were lined up by the Nazis and shot into a pit. And she lived. The bullets didn't hit her. And she went and she lived in the forest and met other partisans in the forest during the second. And this is a woman who glowed. She didn't take life drawing classes because she had seen horror. But look at the courage she has. Is it not true that our resilient students find courage through survival? Is it not true that our resilient students find courage in the stories of the parents and the stories of the grandparents? I say the grandmothers in particular. The stories in England, my students, I have many South Asian students and many Pakistani students, and they remember the wars, and they interview the uncles, and they interview the aunts, and they interview survivors. And the stories are always incredible to me. So perhaps an answer to the question, what kind of poem will help the poetry of our families, the poetry of survival? I cannot hear clearly. But the poetry of survival. And so it's a very interesting question. Is a poem a piece of literature on a page that is stamped as real and official? Or is the poem the sound of the grandfather reminiscing or the grandmother reminiscing in the poetics of the voice of your culture that you listen to and from which you extract meaning that elevates you? My Indian student, who's somewhere perhaps in the audience talking to her grandmother, who shares the wisdom of being, is that not poetry? Because when they speak quickly or they speak slowly, they put juxtapositions of words together. In other words, people are living embodiments of poetry. It's just that when we decide to sit down, I'm going to sit down and write a poem. Okay, I'm going to engage in an aesthetic act. Okay. But what about the aesthetics of daily life? The aesthetics of the mere being of daily life, the aesthetics of living, listening to, and being moved by others. To my mind, this is the aesthetics of liberation, and this can be the meaning of your Indian Liberation Day. Freedom too. Anyway, that's Kupchik's story from beyond. Very dangerous to wind me up. As I say about my students, okay? They say, how do you make a student smart? You wind them up, you let them go. Be careful. Anyway, that's my story to that. So a poem is a poem of life, and resilience and hope is the message of the poem, of people's struggles and of people's liberation, that we learn from others, that others have hope. That others have hope, that others have survived the horrors, that others have survived, and even the smallest little meaningless and irrelevant story, there is liberation. That's how I see it. My mother's family all killed by the Nazis. The poverty that my family comes from. I carry it. I carry it. As you all do. We all come with stories. And the stories, as are told with the sound of our voice, that people can discern the honesty of our being. And so we become role models for them. That's the point. Poetry is being. Poetry is thrownness. Poetry is accepting thrownness. Poetry is encouraging the thrownness of others, their pain and their happiness, because in their pain is hope, because they are permitted to tell us their pain. How many stories are there of Indian liberation? How many stories are there in your families? It is the poetry of being. Doesn't take a philosopher. That's right. Stories have the essence of living. Exactly. That's one of the, I see these little things running through my screen at the bottom. But I can't thank you guys enough. I'll tell you how I feel. I'm always at home in India. See? I'm always at home with the Indians. Why? Because the hospitality of your culture, the hospitality of your being. See? To have survived, I know, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, why do they like English so much? Is this a post-colonial disease? I can hear the critical theorists in the background, but it doesn't matter the language. It doesn't matter the language. For you, the British came and they opened the doors to the West in a certain way, but they opened the door to liberation in a certain way. We liberate ourselves. We must liberate ourselves even from our professors. Is it not correct? Who told us this is what the poem means. And if you don't write it like this, I don't give you a good grade. How many of us can remember the papers that we wrote where we went against the grain and we felt so hurt that it was not appreciated, and yet we survived? Our survival is our liberation. Our survival is the debt that we owe our students to enable them to survive and to feel free to make the mistakes that I make every day. Every day. Turn him off, he'll go on forever. I have to thank you for your smiling face, Kashmata. I tell my students, is it not true? At our university, when you do a synchronous class, the students don't have to turn on the screen, right? That's the rule. You can't make them turn on the screen. But I say to my students, okay, you don't have to turn on your screen. But if I can't see a face, who am I talking to? Myself? As one of my friends says, his uncle would say to him, why are you talking to yourself? Why do you listen to that fool? But when we see a face, we know where we communicate. When we see a face, we know that we're legitimate. Is this not what poetry is?
Yes. Yes.
And the mistakes of poetry?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. We need correction. We trip over ourselves, but the smiling face gives us hope. Can poems smile at us? That's a question. Well, thank you.
Yes, Dr. Gerald, absolutely right. Hope has immense scope.
Yeah. Hope has hope. And we need
hope
it.
Yes, hope has immense scope. And
yeah.
The same thing applies also. Stories have essence of life and music. And poetry has the music to live, not to leave. It has the music to live, L-I-V-E, not to L-E-A-V-E, live.
That's right. No, 100%.
So that's what
we swim. We need to jump in. I got up at 6 o'clock this morning. I made my wife coffee. She's a doctor. She goes off to the hospital. I was a good boy. I showered. I had my little notes. I said, we jump in and we swim because there's no other way to do it. But when we swim among friends, it's different. You see, when we swim among friends, we can feel the nature of the lecture. We've done better lecture, we've done worse lectures. But when we come with good intentions and we come representing others, those in the cocoon at risk, we can only try to do good. That's how I see it.
So one particular comment of mine about your lecture is this: you have reduced the gap between isolation and elation.
Mm-hmm.
So one who enjoys elation during isolation is the real man, is the real human being.
And
because
hope. And that's hope.
Yes, hope is there always. Because if the heart is beating, then the hope is always there. 100%. Hope is not there when the heart stops beating.
That's and elation happens in small things. Eating
Yes.
your favorite cereal.
Yes.
There's no official rule for elation. Elation can mean in the midst of constraint, I had opportunity. The great psychologist Piaget talked about opportunity and constraint. We cannot admit this, but I whisper this quietly to you, the beauty of pandemic traffic in Toronto. Pandemic traffic in March. Nobody is on the street. You can get into your car and go from A to B, flowing through the streets without inhibition. And my students, we did some lovely work on the upside of the pandemic. People renewing acquaintances with people they have not seen in years. People trying a hobby they had not seen because they have time alone. And maybe that's an aspect of hope. Even in the midst of constraint, we see opportunity. And is that not our job with our students? We all know
That's,
it ain't the old days.
Yes.
yeah, that's why someone has said, there is nothing worst in the world as the end of hope.
Yeah.
And Sham sir has said,
Yes, sir.
not only the beating of the heart that generates hope, it is your smiling face that also generates hope.
Beneath the mustache.
sir,
We can still
sir.
see the smiling face beneath the mustache.
Sir, I tell you, you can smile only when the heart beats. If the heart stops beating, you cannot even smile.
But remember, in the midst of the weight of life, sometimes it's hard to smile. In the midst of the weight of tragedy, sometimes it's hard to smile. And to find hope in the midst of constraint, to find hope in the midst of death is a very real challenge.
Yeah, this is the beauty of pandemic, that this has given us an opportunity to meet you, and you have reduced the distance between Canada and India, and you are making us all to smile, even for a while.
That's right. But think
That's
of
the
me.
beauty of
I woke up and
pandemic.
I was ready to cry. Oh my God, will I be ready for these guys? But you see, we smile together. The time that Ashok and Yashpal and I, with Professor Bhatt, spent together, we laughed all the time. They brought me to the cultural wonders and foods of India, and were amazed that I would eat it, not too hot, but amazed that I would happily eat it. But you see, the smiling builds the bridge. The smiling shows the unity of people, because regardless of the color or the place or the family or the this or that, we can all feel relaxed to smile.
Ghanshyam sir, many smile have triggers the beating of heart. They have triggered the beatings of heart. Many smile. So,
but remember, I heard a therapist from India, from Japan say, it's very delicate when you smile at somebody, because we must smile with them, not smile at them.
Right. Yes, Sachdeva sir, absolutely right. Now I think we have the time to go towards another smiling beauty with us, the chairperson.
Well, give it up.
over to Swati.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Gerald, for this enlightening session, and also for patiently answering the questions. And now may I request Dr. Shamita Chaudhary, the chairperson of today's session, to kindly make her remarks and share her inputs. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. It was indeed a pleasure listening to you. And I really had a good time. I think that your words, hope and liberation, gave sparks to many things which were there in my mind. I felt that during the time of crisis, people find themselves faced with lifestyle changes. One of the earliest and most noticeable changes seen during the COVID-19 lockdown was how to fight isolation. And as we teachers, it was our duty to make them know how to fight them. During these anxious weeks, while we teachers were trying to cope up with the students were coping up with how to come back to the colleges or the schools or the universities. So we felt, and as you rightly said, that when we turned to poetry, it really gave us solace, as John Marsh, he has rightly said, when we release ourselves from the need to boil the poem down to a single meaning or theme, the mind moves like a dreamlike, and it's in a very associative way. It tries to preserve this drifting experience, and that is what the purpose and promise of poetry is.
That's right. Liberation.
As you rightly projected a question, what aspect of poetry foster the liberation? And it is rightly said that the poetry is a form of expression. Writing it lets us get out our feelings and the thoughts on whatever you can say subject or whatever experiences we are having. And it, while reading also, it encourages us to connect and find meaning in our experiences. You also said that poetry can have a positive impact both on the student, on the teacher, and whoever the reader is. Not only on the social or the emotional learning, but on the platform to swim ahead in the canopy of hope. So we can say it may offer them a new way of thinking about something. Poetry also triggers part of the brain tied to reward, emotions, and memory. So when we read poetry, it strengthens overall cognitive health and encourages self-reflection. You also rightly pointed out that poetry expresses ideas and emotions through careful control of sound and rhythm. And it is, as we all know, that we all have grown up with reading the Walt Whitman class of Leaves of Grass. And in our Indian scenario, we generally read Where the Mind is Without Fear. And I think everywhere on the Independence Day, the children do recite this poem of Rabindranath Tagore. We also sing songs to rhythmic song lyrics in our cars, recite poetry at our weddings and graduations, and carefully select poetic greeting cards for our loved ones. So how is poetry always trying to inculcate, trying to elevate us towards a word hope, as you pointed out? So poetry is everywhere, and it allows us to access and understand our emotions in unique ways. The famous line of Robert Frost, poetry is when an emotion has found its thoughts and the thought has found words. So poetry is everywhere. It has, you can say, as teachers, we should inculcate within our students
appointment letter
how to write, read, and understand any text. We should also make them a very healthy outlet for surging emotions. What they wish to, they can scribble on their notebooks and all, and read the original expression of their poetry, so that they foster trust, they foster empathy in the classroom community. They know how to move ahead, how to fight against this isolation, against the, you can say, the solitude which they have been confined due to the pandemic. So we can say for many life issues, well-written, insightful poems can have a very powerful impact. The right word at the right time can create epiphanies that have the capacity to transform a person. So the poems do help people to understand themselves and others, and also develop insight on how to handle difficult feelings and relationships. So while reading the poem, the brain transforms the word on the paper into imagery, which engage sense like vision, touch, and sound. The cognitive abilities like logical thinking, memory, and interpretation, as well as what we call the theory of mind, which is the ability to understand other people's thought and feelings. So in the end, I just want, because your session was so grasping, so nice, I just want to say that as we as teachers need to help and develop to find students themselves, within them hope, and also emerge them from their isolation. I thank Professor Ashok Sachdeva sir, Dr. Swati Reddy ma'am, for giving me this opportunity, and especially to you, Gerald Kapchik sir, for making me part of this session, and especially as to chair this session was given this a very unique opportunity was given to me. Thank you very much.
And thank you. And I would take your presentation and I would give it the title, Poetry is the Canopy of Hope.
Thank you.
That's summarized. Poetry is the canopy of hope. Nice.
Thank you.
And you sounded more like a psychologist than I did. The brain. Oh my God, the brain. Thank you, Ashok. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shamata, ma'am. I think those were valuable remarks. And you rightly said, ma'am, that poetry encourages self-reflection. It is about imagery. A poet does think in images. And as Dr. Gerald has pointed out, the thing that is very arresting about whatever you said, ma'am, that poetry is a canopy of hope. And with the word hope, I'm reminded of the English poet P.B. Shelley. I would want to quote. He says, "To hope till hope creates from its wreck the thing it contemplates." So I think poetry, literature as a whole is all about hope. Thank you so much, ma'am. And to quote Helen Keller, "The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart." As the saying goes, that the essence of all beautiful art is gratitude. I would certainly like to thank our esteemed resource person of today's session, Dr. Gerald C. Kapchik, for enlightening us with his knowledge and expertise. Sir, I mention a profound sense of appreciation to you for taking out time from your busy schedule and being here with us. Thank you so much. I wish to thank the chairperson of today's session, Dr. Shamata Chaudhary, ma'am, for her valuable inputs on literature and hope and poetry. My sincere thanks to Dr. Ashok Sachdeva for organizing the event so efficiently. I must place on record my hearty thanks to all the members of the Executive Committee of iSPELL. I do extend my heartfelt thanks to all the attendees for joining today's session and making it successful. I'm sure we are all going home rich. There's a lot of takeaway from today's session. I hand over the session to Dr. Ashok Sachdeva now. Over to you, sir.
Swati madam, you are still there with us. Now is the time for certificate distribution, and Dr. Ghansham will join hands with me, or I'll join hands with him, and let us have this ceremony of certificate distribution. Dr. Ghansham.
Yes, sir. Indeed, it's a pleasure and honor to have Dr. Gerald Kapchik on the platform of iSPELL. And indeed, it's a pleasure, Doctor, knowing you, talking to you, listening to you, and also being enlightened by you. This is a small token from Indian Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature, a small token and a gift to you to remember us more and more, because we need hope more and more. So we hope that you will be on this platform for more number of times. So this is a small token from iSPELL India. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nice.
You guys do great visuals. Look at this. Beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. And this certificate goes to the chairperson, Dr. Shamata Chaudhary, who was smiling throughout the presentation, and the smile and walk a mile. Hope all of us, after smiling, will walk a mile, keep ourselves fit. And this is the ability to stay healthy and fit in this pandemic world. So for doing the honor, Dr. Shamata Chaudhary, this certificate goes to you.
Thank you, sir.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
This certificate goes to the Master of Ceremonies, who has taken us to the end of this particular webinar of ours, Dr. Swati Reddy. So for doing the honors. And we do hope that we will see you more and more times on the platform of iSPELL. So please accept this as a token of our gratitude to you.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm thankful for this
Congratulations.
opportunity. Thank you, sir.
So at the end, I would like to extend my heartfelt regards to the event coordinator of the Independence Month of India, Dr. Ashok Sachdeva, who has chosen Dr. Gerald Kupchik to be the speaker on the next day of independence. And today is the next day of independence. And today is the next day of our Amrit Mahotsav, 75 years of Indian independence. And let this independence make us to lead independent thoughts. Because if a man is independent by his thoughts, he is liberated, he is independent. So let all the thoughts of ours be liberated and independent so that we can make others also the same kind of an entity like we are. Thank you very much. Over to
Statistics of liberation. Yes. So we feel a great sense of gratitude, a high sense of gratitude for Dr. Gerald Kupchik, who acceded to our request. And he's always kind enough to be there with us at all times. And I appreciate the great empathy, the human element, the wisdom that he has shared with us, his epigrams, his humor, and his pithy pointed sayings have always impressed us. And we are always swayed by when we are in his company and when we listen to him. We have President Dr. Jyoti Patil with us. Hello to you, madam. And I formally introduce you to Dr. Gerald. Sir, Dr. Jyoti Patil is the president of our iSPELL, along with Ghanshyam sir, who is the secretary. So I hope we call it a day, sir. Ghanshyam sir, and
yes, sir.
we should, okay. So heartfelt